All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Pete and Brian and Jake here on the next episode of the Ecu-Men. So we're going to do lesson 5 today. We've covered some interesting topics so far to get to this point, and now we're going to move on to creation and the fall of man. So this is going to be a topic that does not have kind of shared views across all of the different denominations of Christianity, because some of them say that this affected people a lot. And there's the Pelagians who say, nah, everyone's good, don't worry about it. Some people think they're already saved and there's no, impacts going forward. There's the Catholic view, which is what we're going to talk about today. So be prepared. Just throw comments to us on YouTube as you guys are listening in. Make sure if you want to follow us on Spotify, iTunes, or SoundCloud, we have stuff out there as well. So whatever way works for you to follow. And enjoy this episode. So kicking it all off, question 48. What is man? So we talked in, I think it was the last episode there, about the angels and creation, and knowing that of all the creations that God made, the two that were sentient and had thought and could make impacts in terms of glorifying God and have free will to work alongside him, it was the angels and it was men. And so angels, we've talked about a lot of their attributes, and now we're going to go into mankind, because here we're going to hit man is the other great creature that was created by God. And what is it? What makes us different than angels? We have a body and a soul. One of the interesting things about this topic is that when we look at some of the early Gnostic heresies, the physical flesh is looked at as a bad thing, almost as if it's evil, as opposed to the fact that the body and soul together are necessary, because Jesus didn't come down and save us in soul alone and say, your bodies, do whatever you want with it. There was a lot of meaning and a lot of implications when Christ incarnated, and actually incarnate to take on flesh, when he took on human flesh to combine it with his divine nature. We're going to talk about that in a future episode. But the main thing here to take away is that man is another one of the creatures that has the capacity to glorify God and work with God's will, and we were made in the image and likeness of God. So when we talk about the image and likeness here, some people get weird about that one as well. So they look at the image of God almost as if we're talking only in God's free will or God's soul. We don't really stop for a minute to think about the fact that our image that we're made in, not so much Adam and Eve as much as it is Jesus and Mary. So I don't know if you guys have anything you want to build on that, because they're the pinnacle for men and for women where we go from here.
I think some people get hung up on just the physical notions, the vast variety that God has created amongst the human people. But also, you also have a variety of souls and virtues and things we bring to the fight. And I always look at it as combined. If you look at an entire population, past, present, and to come, we begin to reflect the totality and the vastness of what God truly is, and how great he is. You can just see that in the talents of some people, and the reflections of our images that have been impressed upon us on our souls. Some people are seemingly have an infinite amount of patience, others perseverance, some towards glories of truth. Some they just completely express none of that, and they freely walk away from whatever God-given talents they have. Like animals, which are purely physical, beastly driven, and by instinct. So we have to not only express that part of our nature in a virtuous way, but embrace the talent that God has given us to reflect that peace.
Yeah, I think the idea that it's body and soul, we have a tendency in the modern world to personify animals. You see that a lot with people. I can't wait to get to heaven to see my dog again.
Sarah McLachlan, man.
That's a tearjerker. I mean, that is always going to make me feel very bad. And I understand that, because all the creatures were put on this earth to serve man to some degree, and dogs being the man's best friend. But yes, we have a soul that is destined to exist forever. Animals do not. It's not said with any sort of joy to be like, hey, your dog's not going to be in I'm not saying that to hurt anyone's feelings, but it is something. It's a trap that we very easily fall into in this modernist world, that humans are no better than just highly evolved or highly intelligent animals. there is a distinct separation between us and the rest of the animal kingdom.
What a diabolical trick, though, because you can easily make the leap after that to the lessening the worth of a human person, thus abortion, thus contraception, and genocides. It's all very easy leap.
This is a great topic that we're about to get into because of the whole idea of creationism, right? Versus modern day, we have evolution pushed, and this is I believe I watched it on Restoring the Faith, and I can't remember who the guest they had on there, Restoring the Faith Media, but this doctor on there he made the argument very well, in my opinion, that everything is underpinned by the creation story. If you take that away, if you go with this evolution, then all of a sudden everything starts to fall apart. And I don't want to go far down that rabbit hole. We're going to stick with the questions here. But it is something that we can keep revisiting because, yes, if you're Satan and you're looking at, how do I destroy mankind or attempt to anyways, right? You have to essentially get them to deny their own worth. And therefore they have nothing they're striving for.
1 degree off. It doesn't seem like much.
Exactly. 360 degrees, and there's only 1 degree of truth, so even if you're on degree 2, you're still wrong.
I can put that video there, and we will link that in the comments section below. That way everyone else can follow on. So we've actually kind of hit already on question 49. And the likeness to God is chiefly in the soul because of the fact that God is spiritual, and all of that type of thing is what we end up getting with the eternal soul that we're blessed with. Then what we'll talk about as we keep going forth is the flesh and what the flesh actually means in this. Like, just as much as the soul shows how much we are like God, ultimately when we just look at the earth, just looking at it quietly, getting away from cities and things like that.
The flat thing that it is.
we don't believe that. Just as
that was a joke. That is a joke. It is round.
So when we look at the beauty that we see there, we have to remember that the human body, as a creation, it is manifesting the glory of God if we actually respect it the way God wants us to use it, to see, just to perceive it, and to envision what it can be for Him. The body is amazing in terms of what it can do. However, just like we were saying before, when everyone decides that, we're just like animals and do whatever we want to do, and so it's just about eating and going and having fun in whatever possible way we can envision, that's when everything starts to fall apart. And no longer are we glorifying God. Now we're just glorifying ourselves in order for comfort. So we have to look at really when Jesus Christ sacrificed Himself to God the Father, He sacrificed body, blood, soul, and divinity. So all of that together is you can see what God values. So when we move on to expand on the soul here, how is the soul like God? The soul is like God because it is a spirit having understanding and free will and is destined to live forever. Free will is really the key here. This is where things start to fall apart with especially Luther, Calvin, and others like them, or they start to deny free will. The entire scripture itself is kind of useless if we don't actually have free will, because the Bible itself, all these scriptures, in large part, especially you're looking at Proverbs, you're looking at the Beatitudes, you're looking at Paul, they're all commandments. They're all directives. In the end, if we're just getting commandments and directives and we have no free will, that is the most unjust thing I've ever seen in my life. That can't be. So we have to realize here that free will is what ties this whole thing together. All of us have a choice in this, whether or not we want to go the way God wants us to go. So we practice our faith, we live our lives as He envisions it, or we don't. So, but free will really is the key here.
It's so easy a kid can do it, right? So you have this logical test that you tend to give things throughout your life. It starts very early. And the free will thing was never much of a hurdle for me, because if God took away our free will, if we didn't have it, if it didn't exist, He's not a very good God. I mean, not good as in like good versus evil, but just being good at it. Because look at the amount of just terrible things that happen on a given day, daily basis, choices people make. If that's what God wills, then there's nothing positive about it. There's no love, there's no virtue, there's none of the things that we extol throughout the entire religion. Therefore, that piece cannot be in existence mathematically in my mind, where it's like, if God is all good, God is all loving, we preach these things, we accept all these tolerances and whatever. Yet God is so wicked that He allows, through active will, stops your will from doing any good and permits these things. Now we're talking permissive versus, or active versus passive will, permissive will. But it just can't exist. It can't coexist at the same time.
Yeah, and this is where Luther loses it from the standpoint of he actually makes the argument, I believe it's in The Bondage of the Will, that the origin of evil is God.
It just falls apart altogether, yeah.
Whoa.
And we took a wrong turn somewhere.
Yeah.
Remember to go back.
So this is where, and we haven't really touched on good and evil, the nature of good and evil, but we have to remember that good is something. It's tangible. It is what God is made of. And even though, yes, tangible, not necessarily in the sense that I can hold a piece of it in my hand, but it's something. It is God, and that's God is only possible, or excuse me, good is only possible with God. That's I think it's John 15:5. We have to remember then that evil, by contrast, is nothing. It's a void. It's an absence of something. Therefore, like, I can't sit there and say that God can make nothing. This starts to get. It doesn't make any sense. So.
It quickly breaks down to I'm probably the problem. Just overall, I'm not aligning towards the will of God. Therefore, I must be contrary to it. Therefore,
well, because at that point you have to deny God. You're just like you were saying. You're denying His divinity. The instant you start to deny God's divinity, God's perfection, then what point is God? Why do you need Him? So I mean, you can do whatever you want apparently because it's already predestined. Maybe you have no free will, or you have all the free will, and there's no God. The whole thing starts to fall apart.
Or like some other religions, you just become your own God.
Just there you go, like the Romans and the Greeks and everybody else who just kind of came up with it as they went. So.
Yeah, I think free will is important too because not only are we talking on the level that you were just talking about, essentially salvation, does it all make sense? Because it's also essentially, I don't want to say this, you never really have an out, like an infallible excuse, right? I think it's in Kingdom in Heaven, director's cut, way better than the theatrical.
Kingdom of Heaven?
Kingdom of Heaven, there, I'm sorry, misspoke. But I believe it's King Baldwin that's talking to Orlando Bloom, Old Balian. A king may move a man, a father may claim a son, but that man may also move himself. And he says, when you stand before God, you cannot say, but I was told by others to do thus, or that virtue was not convenient at that time. This will not suffice, this will not do. Remember that. And I've always liked that quote because you always have a choice. It may be a painful consequence of that choice, but you always have a choice, and the onus is always on you to continually strive to do God's will. There's never a time interacting with other humans in which you can say, well, I guess I got to just go along with this. I just got to, get on the pain train.
I think that's going to be one of the hardest things that after you accept it, and you sit there and you look at the difficulty that it is to accept the fact that there is free will. Therefore, God will permit evil to occur. It's not that He's willing it Himself. It's that He's sitting there saying, no, free will said, do whatever you're going to do. However, this means at the end, this is when we start talking about death and judgment and hell and heaven, why judgment is what it is and why the whole thing makes sense.
Well, justice makes sense at that point. You had already mentioned it before. Like, I talked to somebody, this probably had to have been about within the past 6 months. And he's in a car ride with a friend of mine, and he's not a believer or anything like that. And he's talking about, you believe this, you believe that. And we were discussing it, and he said, I just don't see how God can punish us. If he supposedly gave us free will, but then He punishes us for using it, which is, I mean, I don't even know how that makes sense to
Twisted.
To think of. But justice makes sense. Like, hey, here is a choice. Do the right thing, do the wrong thing. There will be consequences. Like, everything starts to fall in line. And it also, by the way, free will makes the sacrifice of Jesus that much more glorious. The fact that He chose to do this. He did not have to. He chose to do it.
This is a really good lead in because it allows us to hit that next key question here that we're going to have to talk about is that who are the first man and woman? And we're not talking about apes. We're not talking about any other weird nonsense.
Not old monkey bones.
No, none of that nonsense. We're sitting here saying, when we read Scripture, what were we told? The first man was Adam, and the first woman was Eve, and they are the parents of the entire human race. They had free will. Free will,
as the first two humans, and therefore probably damned us.
It's justice. Going back to justice. So the real problem here that I have especially when talking with Protestants, talking with Muslims or Jews or whatever. And honestly, atheists and agnostics, everyone starts to tear apart morality. So morality really has no foundation because, well, anyone can really do whatever anyone wants because, I mean, who really knows what's right anyways? It's really twisted to say that God would tell us in Matthew 5:48 to be perfect, and that Paul would tell us be perfect, and all these other people would say be perfect, but never actually tell us how to be perfect, never actually give us the equation, never actually sum up for us, no, clearly, guys, this is right on this side, and on that side is terribly wrong. Don't do it. If we don't have that clear delineation, it is the most unjust and horrible and cruel thing for a God to then punish us eternally for something he never told us how to do. And therefore, since we know definitively, based on Jesus' words, God is just, infinitely just, and infinitely merciful. The only reason he can be infinitely merciful is because he's infinitely just. The end, his justice is there because he told us exactly what to do. We know what right and wrong is. And when Adam and Eve were first set in the garden, guess what? They already had a set of things they were allowed to do and a set of things they were not allowed to do. And so it's not that God would punish us for using our free will. It's that God would punish us for abusing our free will in a way that is contradictory to his commandments. Therefore, we bucked his system. We refused his grace. We refused all of his wisdom and intelligence and said, no, hold my beer. I got this.
Yeah, it's not just that we didn't just choose his way, right? The preferred way or privileged path, right? It's not like, hey, this is the best way. You can take, the back scenic route. Any choice we make that is not his will is in direct contradiction to it, like by definition.
I think I go through this at least twice a week with different people, but we are going to serve one of two masters. It's going to happen. If you choose a good God who isn't lording it over you like some I don't know, like a slave master. Think the terrible Satan image of just fear and overlording.
Honestly, if I was going to go somewhere, I would think of like the stereotypical white slaveholder 1800s. That guy who's like, no, man, go out there and do some horrible stuff because I don't really care about you, and really, it's just don't hurt yourself though while you're at it. Like,
just channeling your inner Bernie right now.
Yeah, it's
straw hat, a blue waistcoat, and a bullwhip.
That's the image we conjure, right? But then at the same time, on the other hand, you have this loving father figure who is stern and has set rules for the road, and like any good child, you're going to play within the parameters that are set for you, and there's total freedom there, and you realize how much freedom eventually once you so for those that aren't converted or not Catholic or not living a moral life, I wouldn't have believed it either 10, 15 years ago, but there is a complete and absolute freedom being within the confines of the law, the parameters of the law, and you're not tethered to the world in a particular way that I think we've grown accustomed to, that culturally we push and try to it's almost like the bad kid. It's like, no, man, you should come do X, Y, or Z with us because he doesn't want to be alone in his the misery of the darkness that he's dwelling in. Misery loves company, but they decided to step out of bounds, and I think Father Ripperger always had a good analogy there with the kid that runs out in the traffic after not listening to his parents and staying in the yard. You step out of the protection of the law, and then you get smacked.
Well, how many? So yes, when God created Adam and Eve, right? There's an innate sense because we share the innate sense of justice, mercy. The right way. God's will is not hidden from us. Tells us what to do, what not to do, and then obviously they stumble, and justice is served upon them and all their descendants. And an easy illustration of that is, of course, they were instructed along the way, right? Because if you go into a gas station on a road trip, you might get a soda, you might get a candy bar, right? But you're not going to spend $100 buying up every bit of candy. If you take a 7-year-old boy and say you can get whatever you want, he's coming out with bagfuls and bagfuls of candy, soda, whatever he wants. And if you do that every single time, very quickly, the wheels are going to fall off for that young child, whether that's diabetes or whatever it is, rotting teeth. Like, there needs to be instruction, right? Which is given by, the parent to be like, hey, no, you get one piece of candy or you get no pieces of candy. You need a bottle of water, whatever it is. So the idea that somehow we were just created, this is a very popular one, we were just created and it was just set into motion like dominoes, and he just kind of sitting back and watching what happened, we wouldn't have lasted this long if that was what was going on, honestly.
The cool thing is that God gives us enough grace that if we actually do his will, we can get through any of those situations with the discipline we need to exhibit, with the strength that we need, the fortitude to actually withstand any of the pain that comes along with it. In the end, all of us emulating the sacrifice that Christ made for us, which is awesome. It's really cool. The problem is, though, what happens when it goes away? And that really is going to hit these next two questions here. So when we're looking at the chief gift bestowed upon Adam and Eve by God, sanctifying grace, it made them children of God and gave them the right to heaven. This is what we're all trying to work for, to come back to God. And although there are those who would assert that Christ actually saved us on the cross versus redeemed us on the cross, and then trying to act like, again, going back to, well, I mean, I'm saved, so I mean, my free will, it's whatever, right? Now, we got to go and put this whole thing together of going, what happens with sanctifying grace? I can do what God wants because I'm actually committing myself to him and he actually continues to be with me. Or I can make the choice, I don't really want to follow. I'm going to go my own way. And then in the end, going back to that whole problem with losing sanctifying grace, losing that protection, in the end, it's refusing. You basically slap God's hand away. There's not much left at that point.
If you did not lose it, right? If we don't have something to strive to gain back, again, it all falls apart. Like if there was no fall, then there's no real journey back to it, right? Because then you come into the evolutionary idea where we were just two apes or whatever beings that have just continuously gotten better, right? And so
random creatures, but
that's why when we look back, we have this innate hubris amongst humanity, right? To look back a generation ago, 2 generations ago, 100 years ago, however long ago, and just be like, what idiots. Right? Like we know what is going on, but that comes because of the widespread acceptance of the evolutionary theory that Adam and Eve were not the first two people created, that it was just a long, random, maybe even what a lot of people like to do to try and rectify the Bible and what they think is science, a guided process over millennia to get to humans. But again, all that just falls by the wayside, crushes. How did we have a fall from grace then? Like at what point were we like, all right, this is Adam and Eve, whereas your parents were monkeys? It doesn't make any sense. But yes, if you take away the gift that God bestowed upon us, which is sanctifying grace, to be able to share in his beatific vision, if you take that away or take away the fall, which we're about to talk to, then pretty much everything after that, subsequent to it, falls apart. Because that is the underpinning that holds up the whole story. That is setting the stage, as it were, for the great redemption that is Jesus Christ.
Well, and I think now is a good time that let's finish setting that stage. So question 53, what other gifts were bestowed upon Adam and Eve by God? This is where they got happiness in the Garden of Eden, great knowledge, control of the passions of reason. They got freedom from suffering and death. In the end, this is where they got control over animals. That's why they were able to name them. They got physical health.
God
no
was
ailments.
Not a card-carrying PETA member. They were not just free to roam. They're our beast of burden.
And ultimately, all of this, God would allow them to maintain so long as they followed his commandments. So getting on to question 54, what commandment did God give to Adam and Eve? He went very, very specific. Not obscure or anything. He's like, I don't know what he wanted.
Not talking in riddles.
No riddles, no parables on this one. He basically said, do not eat of the fruit of that certain tree that grows in the garden. Period, done. Everything else they were allowed to eat from, so they could consume. They could go anywhere else in the garden. And in the end, no burdens, no hardships, nothing. One commandment. And unfortunately, they didn't really do too well with that.
Let's set the stage in a very unambiguous way. So God has given them, through sanctifying grace, complete understanding and knowledge of the natural environment which he has produced for them. They're living in this garden, and they know what all of this is. They know why it's there. They have control over these things. They're naming animals. They're going through this. And then they're presented with an option. So this isn't some childish or toddler-like picture that's painted for people sometimes, where it's like, They were just duped by the serpent. Like, it just was crazy. You should have seen it. No, they had one rule. It was pretty plain. Don't eat that. Okay? Anything else, fair game. And, of course, they're like, okay, sounds good. And then, I'm not going to get into who fell first.
Does it sound good?
But does it? Yeah. So now the temptation's there. And they had or at least Eve did. I guess she was the first up to bat, right? In the failure department.
Yes.
So it was like, oh, I could be like God. I'm always fixated on this childlike innocence. When Christ says, this is part of the pure heart, at least the way I meditate on it, is that we have to get back to what she lost. It is the understanding, you're functioning in the supernatural grace that, hopefully you're maintaining a state of grace. And then that complete trust, faith, and obedience that comes with that.
Yeah, and I'm going to emphasize here too, because of the listening audience, not sure all your backgrounds and whatnot, but I want to emphasize too, even though we brought up the fact that Eve does sin first, that does not mean that her sin was greater than Adam's. Both of their sins were horrendous in terms of why God would be so angry that I gave you one job and they totally shirked it and just blew it for the rest of us. Adam had an obligation as well in his role to just say no. He had every capacity in him with the sanctifying grace that he'd been given by God to be like, no, let's go talk to God about this one. What just happened there? He didn't. He had in his grasp the ability to avoid the rest of the damage and punishment that was going to ensue, and he did not. So in the end, the point being, when we get to question 55, did Adam and Eve obey the commandment of God? Nope, they ate of the fruit.
Spoiler alert.
And what does that mean? Well, the problem is I think that, I know in my Protestant days, I looked at this and just everything all twisted up on itself in terms of, well, is it really a bad thing that they ate of that fruit? I mean, then they now know what evil is. Look at that. And you don't want to know what evil is. The only reason you can possibly have any capacity and knowledge of what evil is because you're watching people in the process of offending God. None of us should ever revel in that sight of watching an offense against God. I don't want to know about them. I don't want to go and find out about them. And in the end, this entire world is now filled with them. This insane chain reaction that starts with Adam and Eve and goes right into the next generation so that Cain kills Abel. And it just keeps going. It never stops.
Well, here's how twisted the culture is today. So on one hand, we will celebrate the murder of a child in the womb. And celebrate it as women's rights, or
on stage
even, yeah, on TV where you can watch it in comfort of your home.
Well, to women's rights, we call it's a Western freedom. That's how right? we love to call it. They died for Western freedom.
So on one hand, we celebrate this, and on the other hand, we could practically crucify a guy like Harvey Weinstein, right? Who again is just indulging in more sinful behavior, unapologetically, seemingly from my end, but yet people aren't, reveling in that. But then again, we'll turn around the other side. And how many, young men go out and waste time in strip clubs or other, music scenes or clubs?
But it's selective. This whole act, this is Sixth Commandment. We're going to get to that coming up here. And I think Jake had the best analogy that you've talked about in terms of the one that talks about how meaningful the act is versus how versus the meaningless act. Mm-hmm. That we compare it to what would we was it taking a pencil or whatever it was?
Oh yeah, so the whole idea, if we're going to talk about fornication in the modern culture, and the idea that sex is it's just a natural bodily function, right? There's no need to attach anything more to it, right? There's no sacred bond between man and wife. There's no spiritual value to that act. And it's just, hey, we're just humans. We're just animals, right? And we're able to stop ourselves from, conceiving a child, and therefore that means we can seek pleasure, right? So if you reduce it to just a bodily function, another bodily function I can think of is eating. So therefore, if I steal a fry off your plate, is that not just as evil as raping you? I mean, if you take it to the logical conclusion that hey, we're just bodily functions. Yes, I should not take food from you. Yes, I should not, whatever it is. Then what's the difference between that and sexual assault?
Right. And this is where when we go and put it all together, then.
If you're only doing it, just to follow up on that point though, real quick, mm-hmm. is also because people are going, whoa, stealing a fry and rape. But obviously I think there's a massive, massive difference between that. Venial, mortal. We'll get into that
Yeah.
later episodes as well. But the whole idea is, again, if we are just animals, right, and there is no, Adam and Eve didn't create, we were just evolved from monkeys. There is no God. All these things that people like to say. Where do we get this idea of justice and morality? Like, how does that even formulate?
Universal sense.
How does a universe? Everybody has that sense, to some degree, people disagree, but everybody has that gut feeling, like in their bones, like this is not right, this is not good, right? So first of all, where does that come from? But we'll sideline that. If you have somebody that is literally like, hey, I'm a hedonist, right? I'm only here to have a good time, here for a good time, not a long time. I am, my physical being is the sum of my experiences. We see that a lot. Oh, I want to travel the world. I got my bucket list, all this stuff, right? Then again, everything you're doing is within yourself. You're not acting outside of yourself, all right? Which is how Eve and Adam should have been acting, right? Hey,
Right.
I should be acting outside of myself. God told me to do this, but instead they both acted within themselves, their own temptations, right? So if we're acting that way, only within our own predisposition and what we want to do and what we like, again, you start following that to its logical conclusion when you come to fornication, and very quickly sexual assault and rape become okay, because that other person is not a person anymore. They are just another animal, and they are just there for my sexual gratification. And very quickly you start running down that headlong into a very dark place.
Yeah, and that's what I think we can. In moving into the next two questions here, the emphasis item here is when God gives us a function, God gives us a capacity, and He says, "I need you to glorify me by doing exactly what I asked you to do," and then we decide in our, I'm going to put air quotes here, infinite wisdom to be like, no, I think I could do this better, and I'm going to do something else. I'm going to reevaluate whether or not this thing is actually as important as God says it is. At that point, I don't think we should expect anything other than God's justice. We have now decided to be like, it's not that big a deal. I mean, I know you made it to procreate the race and to go and make new souls and to populate heaven, and that really, on earth, although we have children, really we're only stewards of God's souls. He's the one who's actually going to be their parent eternally in terms of what's supposed to happen. So this is a really big deal, adding more creatures to heaven. Otherwise, all the angels were created in an instant. He creates billions of creatures. He creates humans, starting with Adam and Eve, and says, all right, now I'm going to be with you as I make more souls and figure out whether or not you want to be in heaven with me or not. Like, in the end, if we refuse all of that, we shouldn't expect anything other than justice. So when it all comes down to it, question 56, what happens on account of the sin? Sanctifying grace, bye-bye. Right to heaven, bye-bye. All of it, done. And then when we go into 57, what happened to us on account of Adam's sin, all of their descendants now share in that punishment because it's just. In the end, you said you didn't want any of your progeny to be with me. In the end, God then looks at us and says, fine, be wherever you will. Be done with it.
This should show you the magnitude of the sin, because God is infinitely just, but He's also, as we said earlier, infinitely merciful. And He gives us so many warning shots. Back to the fornication bit. How many STDs float around in the world? Like, that is just a merciful warning shot going, hey guys, if you don't want to suffer like this, you should clean up your lifestyle, then you won't have these problems. I think that's a natural way of just looking at His patience with that. But this, the shot heard around the world follows every single generation of human beings that comes after the sin, to the point where we all need to be baptized and cleansed of it. So it's just the ripple effect.
Yeah, and the question is, why was the sin so great? I mean, all they did was eat an apple. They got a little curious. They got talked into it. They literally used their free will given to them by God. And I don't want to phrase it as like they chose their free will, right?
But intentionally.
They intentionally aligned their free will in direct opposite of God by aligning it with what the serpent wanted. Like, they did that.
Walked into darkness under their own power. Period. And in the end, then, this is going on to question 58.
And
that's
also
original
tried to
sin.
hide from God.
Yeah, at that point,
Let's do that one too.
Blame it on his wife.
The whole thing's a mess when sitting there and trying to hide from God. So in the end, the original sin compounded then as they're starting to... Actually, they feel guilty about it. They know something's wrong now. Everything else starts to come apart. Yeah. the conscience starts to eat at them. In the end, you got to think their guardian angels are sitting there and weeping over that as well. I can't think those guardian angels, Adam and Eve's guardian angels, were thrilled about this
I
moment.
was so psyched for this assignment, and you mucked it up.
There was only 2 of you. We got selected.
And so then original sin then results in what you were saying, Brian, is then now that's where the sacraments come in. This is where the church is going to come in. This is where Christ in and of himself is going to decide that first and foremost, I must take on flesh like my creatures, and I must lead them, and I must set the example, and I will offer myself for them, and then I'm going to give them every single power to get back into my good graces so that they can do it right, and they can make up for original sin.
Hang on, Pete. Would you say that God literally did everything he possibly could except take away our free will in trying to correct this?
Everything except for taking away free will. Exactly. Yes, it's justice again. And infinitely merciful all at the same time. Going, okay, I know you just made the dumbest mistake of your entire lives right there. But I'm not going to go back on my word and take away your free will. He's still stuck totally with it. And to be fair, he even left the angels with their free will after doing a whole bunch that, their fall in the beginning. So God, the amount of patience that he has should be awe-inspiring and humbling to everyone who looks at it, going, he's just still putting up with people doing all this offensive stuff. And in the end, we shouldn't be surprised at all if and when people get chastised or some punishment comes afterwards. Because in the end, you look at what happened in the garden as a result of original sin and like getting cast out and all the other stuff. It just, it makes sense.
It's ultimate diabolical disorientation where it's like, okay, the lava's flowing, the earthquakes hit, the meteors are coming. It's like, why would God do this to us? well, I mean, have you seen yourselves?
Because you took an infinite God's command and treated it like it was worthless. So in the end, infinite God can only respond in an infinite capacity.
Yeah, we totally deserve it.
And there's a lot of justice too with the idea of Jesus goes, all right, now I gotta come in. I'm gonna have to come in, be made flesh, and save the day. So he's the new Adam, and then obviously, with the whole commandment of God saying, serpent, you crawl on your belly, and you shall bite at the heel of the woman, and she shall crush your head. And then right there you have the awesome poetic justice and foreshadowing that is Mary.
Yeah. And so then moving into the next question here, why is the sin called original? It's the first one. So before that, Adam and Eve are basically created for all intents and purposes perfect. It's just they took an otherwise perfect will and decided, I don't feel like using it perfectly. I want to use it for my own self, devoid of God's intentions, and in the end, use it for a dark purpose. So then this is where we were kind of touching on it a little bit. What are the chief punishments of Adam, which we inherit through original sin? The chief punishments which we inherit through original sin: death, suffering, ignorance, and a strong inclination to sin. Look at the world today, folks. This is what we are seeing as a result of original sin. Many of these people have not been baptized, so they have not even received the basic foundational graces necessary to come back and do what God asks them to do. And then of the people that have received baptism and are trying to go and get back in the alignment with God, are arguing about the interpretation of how this whole thing is supposed to work out to try to get any of that back, to fix all of the suffering and all the damage. Because right now, God is the only solution to this whole problem.
Or in their ignorance, willfully turning away from truth that's being taught them.
It's also double back on what you said earlier. The more they indulge in the sin, the more it takes to kind of get the same dopamine type reaction.
Oh, it's so true. I mean, just look at drug addicts, alcoholics, any sort of addict. The physiological effects that type of behavior has on you, is not coincidental. It's not good for you.
It eats at you.
The physiological, the psychological, but then also just think of the spiritual wounds you're creating on your body, on your soul, I should say, every time you do that. I
think it's the piece that people often neglect is if you're in a tragic car accident, catastrophic, most people can envision the amount of physical therapy and healing and medicine and time in hospitals. People can kind of tangibly relate to that in some way, shape, or form. But the spiritual wounds, if you woke up tomorrow and somebody showed you the depravity you would find yourself in after 10 years of pornography abuse, speaking of men, this is a terrible scourge on the culture right now, you'd probably be just you just revolt at just the sheer idea of where you could be. Yet you never get there. You don't jump in the deep end. It's incremental, and it's each little scar, each temptation, each
temptation draws you into yourself. It takes away your ability to act altruistically, to act outside of yourself, to act towards a higher power that God is calling you for. It takes away that, and you just retreat further and further into yourself to where you're becoming a terrible son, a terrible husband, a terrible brother, a terrible father.
And you didn't see it coming. Oftentimes, right? So,
and your only recourse is to keep doing it more, hoping that that fleeting pleasure that you get out of drugs, alcohol, anger, whatever it is, gambling, like whatever your vice is, thinking that, all right, well, I'll just chase that happy high again, or traveling, right? Your traveling addiction, throwing away all your other responsibilities in life just for that next cool road trip, whatever it is, or pornography being a big one. But the more you do, the more you retreat in, and the more you're just left there in torment, chasing that
That's terrible enough, right? So for those that are listening and maybe are just now contemplating what a moral life looks like and the struggles involved, if you've spent 20 or 30 years, 40 years or more wandering off the path that was set for you, you must understand there's a lot of time to heal and claw your way back, and it's going to be a fight and a process.
It can happen quickly.
It can happen
but
quickly.
It will hurt.
Yes,
exactly.
You will suffer.
It's like resetting the bone.
Yes, and the healing will eventually occur.
There seems to be this idea that we can just flip the light switch and just be like, oh, you know what? Like, I know how I should be living, but this is pretty fun. But before I die, I'm going to get around to, I just need this one thing to happen, right? I'm a single guy. I just need to get married, and then I'll quit pornography or whatever it is. Or I just need my kids out of the house, and then I'll, quit gambling their college savings or whatever it is. This idea that we can somehow flip it, and after, like you were saying, 30 or 40 years walking down the wrong path, to think that we can somehow just
bust a Yui right there.
Bust a Yui in a jetpack and just drop right back on the path. It's going to take you, if not as temporally as long as you've been doing that, but at least, like you were saying, Pete, painfully, it'll take you, you'll have to pay that price to get back. Because God needs to know if you're worth it, if you really want it.
And I think we need to go into this justice piece again. So that's where question 61 goes. Is God unjust for punishing us on account of Adam's sin? The answer here in the Catechism, God is not unjust in punishing us on account of the sin of Adam, because original sin didn't take away anything to which we have a strict right as human beings, but only the free gifts which God in his goodness would have bestowed upon us if Adam had not sinned. In the end, the thing is that Adam and Eve were punished by ultimately having their children now suffer. It's just a family thing. If mom and dad don't pay their taxes, are the kids ultimately going to suffer whenever the law comes down from the government to be like, okay, and now we're going to throw mom and dad in jail? Or whatever else happens. There are many things that ultimately impact that next generation. I don't think we should be surprised at all. If mom and dad didn't really care enough about their kids to sit there and try to say, you know what, maybe I shouldn't go and take this next mistake. Maybe I shouldn't try to get one over on the government. Maybe I shouldn't try to take advantage of these other people in a business situation or whatever. Maybe I should think about how this is going to result. And if Adam and Eve would have done that in the end, that, okay, Cain and Abel may not have gotten into their situation where Cain decides he's just going to kill, the second born of Adam and Eve.
I think that's totally true because, you look at the idea, we always say, well, how is it fair for the son to be punished for the sins of the father? The son didn't do that. I think that's looking at the wrong way. I think you have to look at it how you were just talking about it, Pete, which is, as the father, you need to realize your responsibility and the weight of every decision you make. That's the lesson to be learned there. The impact that your decisions, the ripple effects through the generations can have on your family even today. I don't think to focus on the, woe is me, I didn't have anything to do with this, why am I being punished, is, I think, the wrong lesson to take from that.
And I think that now we can get to the kicker of this lesson. So final question here. And this is the one that is going to be probably the most controversial with non-Catholics out there. And even some Catholics I think there's probably that they haven't been catechized in a way where they would clearly understand this one. But
cultural Catholics might not like it, yeah.
Yeah. So the question here is, was any human person ever preserved from original sin? The answer is yes. The Blessed Virgin Mary was preserved from original sin in view of the merits of her divine Son, and this privilege is called her Immaculate Conception. And now, although there are going to be people who try to argue that this is not biblical, as an example, they need to read a little bit more of the Church Fathers. And I know Dr. Brant Petrie puts together a really nice book that actually explains this entire concept and how it is absolutely biblical, first and foremost, and second, it's absolutely logical. So, how offended was God by original sin that he threw Adam and Eve out of the garden, all sorts of punishments abounding, and said not only that, but it's going to go generation to generation as a result of everything you have done because you decided you cast me away. Well, I don't think you understand how this works. Let me show you. Bam. And reality hits them really hard. Well, then meanwhile, what he had intended to do for the redemption of mankind was then incarnate, take on flesh. Would he do that in an unclean vessel? No. They even bring that up later on. Is it Paul who talks about not putting wine into dirty vessels? Or is it
Old
Christ?
skins.
Yeah. It's sitting there saying that, which is why the miracle at Cana was such a big deal. Because they took wash water and turned wash water into the best wine ever. Because it's just God. That's what he does. Well, by the same token, then what does he do when he's going to come into the world? Well, he chose to come through a woman, but not just any woman. He said, this one I want actually as pure and perfect as anyone that has ever been conceived.
How meticulous was he when it came to the ark, the instructions?
Yeah, the physical man-made ark, not the one that he would help conceive with Anne and Joachim.
I mean, this is where the Protestants, and I was a Protestant for a long time.
As was I.
It's a disconnect. You just never connect the theology that all of a sudden God got really cool. He's not angry anymore. That's the God of the Old Testament. You start like
anger management.
Yeah, like something happened where all of a sudden you begin to rationalize your sinful life, and you're like, no, we're cool. I'm saved, man. Now he's totally just mercy right now, but he is and ever shall be as he was. And if he was this meticulous with the care and instruction of his priests and the ark and the liturgy of the Jews, and all of this transfers forward.
Yeah, has anyone read the book of Leviticus? He's pretty specific.
Yeah, it's pretty dry. I'm just, it's very detailed. And yet now he gets to create his own vessel through his own will, his own
mom.
plan.
He gets to make one.
Yeah.
It's very important, too, that we make clear Mary is not a straw with which he just passes through to get to this, because
other classic.
Yeah, well, God could have just, if he wanted to become man, he could have became man as he created Adam, just out of the dirt. But no, he wanted to share in our humanity. But it's important, the Holy Spirit and Mary, like, he got a chromosome from Mary. Like, he didn't just just come in there and then, she was...
Yeah, they share genetic code. Technically, mothers share genetic code of their kids. Mary actually is going to have Jesus actually forever in her DNA, which is amazing.
Assumed his flesh from her.
He would have looked like the Blessed Virgin.
Yes, at some level. So in the end, we're looking at there's a lot of justice here in that God is going to give to those people what they deserve. And by the same token, he's going to sit there and say, nothing less than perfection is acceptable to him, as he continues to say. So if he doesn't want us to be anything less than perfect, and that's what he commands, and he says, do all the things I command of you. So it's perfection, perfection, perfection. Why would he do anything less than make a perfect mom in order to bring himself to us? And in the end, then his only mechanism to do that, because Mary's parents still had original sin, was to actually take it from her so that in the end she would be conceived free of it, not to suffer any of the ills that Adam and Eve suffered, in the end being that clean vessel to bring and to nourish.
She still needs redemption too. He just does it beforehand as opposed to after his passion.
Yep. So
and there's the other way of looking at her as the new Eve, to kind of circle all the way back around.
Because because you have a man and a woman both created perfectly, right, without sin, and they both choose to align their will against God's. And then obviously you have Jesus, fully man, perfect. You have Mary, Mary, who chose God's will by saying, yes, I will do this for my God. But she's created out sin, and instead of putting her will counter to God's, she chooses God's will. And it's against that poetic justice of the Bible, where instead of her eating from the tree of knowledge and thus damning all of humanity, she's
Humble.
and she saves all of humanity.
Yeah, she becomes the redemptrix. And so there's a bunch of cool things about Mary that I think will get covered in other episodes, but there's a bunch of parallels here. I think we can probably dig up some of those. And like I said, I'll try to link that.
And also, who do we think it is that crushes the head of the serpent?
That's right.
From Genesis. She fulfills that.
Yes.
More spoiler alerts here.
That's right. The offspring of Eve. So
I'm just saying George R. R. Martin couldn't write a better book.
So
You can't even write a good book, really.
I've only read one. It was just like the first season.
So
I should say the first season was just like the book.
So on that note, that will cover the rest of episode 5. So we're going to hit episode 6 next time. You guys listen in. Thank you for sticking with us the whole time. We're going to make sure, like I said, links in the description below on YouTube or however you're subscribing to us. Like I said, hit us up Spotify, SoundCloud, iTunes, and we'll keep adding more content. So come back and check us out. Subscribe, please. We appreciate it. We're trying to work on building that community up. And then the other thing is, hey, if you want to hit up our store, hit up our blog, follow us on Twitter. There's a bunch of other stuff out there. So thanks again for listening. And as always, St. Joseph, pray for us.